Hello, welcome. All right, let me get your names down. Just a moment. So I apologize that you haven't been able to see your assignment yet. That's my terrible omission. It'll be put up as soon as I'm done with this video, and it'll pertain to the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal to combat the Great Depression in the 1930s. So let's see here. Let's see here. So as I'm getting these names down, are there any questions? All right. So let's go ahead and share the screen. I'm going to go to my FDR notes. Here are some of the major historical interpretations that I've come across reading books on the New Deal or biographies on Franklin Roosevelt. He was a relative to Teddy Roosevelt. I don't recall. I had it memorized at one time, and I apologize exactly how. It wasn't incredibly close. It wasn't a nephew or a first cousin, I don't believe. But they were definitely related, and they were invited to one another's family special occasions, etc. And he actually was a Democrat. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican. And Teddy Roosevelt claimed to be progressive, and so did Franklin. They shared that in common, despite being on the opposite aisle of the two-party system. So let's see here. One, right, like with H.W. Brands, his book here, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Traitor to His Class. I favor H.W. Brands. I like his books. But at any rate, he adheres to Keynesian economics, the wisdom thereof. Because under this idea, right, this economic school of thought is that capitalism, if left unhindered, if left laissez-faire, right, if the government just lets it be, that it naturally leads, and this is kind of a Marxian interpretation, Karl Marx and Engels had written this critique of capitalism, is that it leads to consolidation. It's too Darwinian and too loose, so that the big guys gobble up the small guys, and you get an infinite number of mergers, big government swallow or big corporations swallowing up smaller competitors, and the proletariat, the class that that labors with its hands in the factories, particularly in the industrial economy, it grows and grows exponentially as people of the petty bourgeoisie, of the petty business class, get gobbled up and knocked back down into the proletariat. And the capitalists, the corporate leaders, they continue to be a smaller, numerically smaller and smaller, but more dominant group, until things are so lopsided, so inequitable, that Karl Marx called for a revolution from the proletariat, right? In Marxist writings like the Communist Manifesto and Capital and other books that he wrote. And so he and Engels actually wrote them, I think. But at any rate, so with Keynesian economics, is they contend that it is the responsibility of the government to ensure purchasing power for the common man. That is the ultimate barometer, or the main barometer or measuring stick for deciphering how healthy or how unhealthy an economy is looking at what percentage of the general population of the common folk have disposable money, disposable income in their pockets that they're willing and able to spend. And so how does the government go about doing that, right? Trying to ensure that that the common person has spending power. We're going to look into that shortly here with the New Deal. But it's important to remember that that is an ideological turn, arguably, from our political tradition. We were never truly a laissez-faire, a capitalist economy. Remember, if you've taken your 101, Alexander Hamilton and his national bank and his bond system and his tariffs to protect industry, we were never truly laissez-faire. Nevertheless, when you look at a lot of the proverbial brakes, kind of, right? Like brakes on a car, the different brakes that we have put into the economic system, as far as, thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that, form trusts, engage in predatory pricing, price conspiracies, etc. None of those existed for quite some time. And so you see the robber barons. We saw that in the Gilded Age assignments, the first one in particular, them take advantage of this kind of this lack of laws regulating the economy. And so they did some, shyster-like stuff to one another and to their competitors. And we've gone over some of that data before. And so now this is a break from that philosophy, right? Where they're going to say, no, the government needs to get involved and make sure that everyone has a true fair chance at the American dream. Okay. And so we've gone over the progressives and their regulation of big business. So this is definitely along that line in progressive tradition, bigger government oversight and regulation over big business, right? But it's going to go further than that as far as directly helping the common man. And so at any rate, so to some people like H.W. Brands, Franklin Roosevelt was almost nothing short of revolutionary. Remember, revolutionary is, to me, it constitutes a 180-degree turn politically, economically, and socially. And so that's a very strong adjective to use in defining Franklin Roosevelt as revolutionary. And then, of course, it's been stigmatized as a bad thing, and he's going to face a lot of opposition, as you could imagine, from big business, etc., and from other segments of society who see him as being radical. There was a Father Laughlin who had a big radio following, like over 1 million people following him on the radio. And he was really anti-Franklin Roosevelt and anti-New Deal. And he had a following in being such. But at the same time, in hindsight, the way that our economy has turned and the government has intervened much more, and particularly ostensibly, right, supposedly, in defense of the common American consumer, the common American entrepreneur, the common American worker, that we're proud of that we see that turn to where we are today, thanks to the courage and the vision of Franklin Roosevelt and his administration. So good or bad, villain or hero, H.W. Brands sees him as revolutionary. So he definitely was for Keynesian economics, for bigger government involvement to ensure that the common man had purchasing power, because they felt that primes the pump and keeps everything economically flowing. Some evidence for that, when you look at his informal cabinet, he didn't have the audacity to put these people up for the actual cabinet positions. And a lot of people contend because he knew they were seen as being too radical, and the Senate would not have approved of their positioning. So in almost surreptitious way, he snuck them in informally, and he made them work with his official cabinet, which was, as you would guess, his official cabinet members were not as controversial as these gentlemen. So I just put a few names up here. Ray Moley and Rex Tugwell. Felix Frankfurter was a judge, actually. But at any rate, with Ray Moley and Rex Tugwell, they supposedly, in some narratives, were kind of the radicals behind the curtain, if you will, ensuring that revolutionary change ensued. All right, we're going to get to some of the details of that soon. So no more reliance upon a laissez-faire magician of the market itself to resolve its own problems, but the government was to give direction, planning. I know that's a very generic term, but you find a planned economy in a lot of Marxist writings versus a free market economy. So free market economy to a more planned economy. And that term itself, and yes, Franklin Roosevelt was a decently read man. He went to Ivy League school. He was aware of the fact that different followers of Karl Marx and others had used that term. And so it was associated with radical differences from a capitalist economy. Valeria, nice to have you. I'll make sure everyone's name is down. So moving on, another interpretation by Leuchtenberg, his Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal by William E. Leuchtenberg. This one, he contends and says, I don't think this guy was a revolutionary. I don't think he was an ideologue, someone who had a stubborn, radical new vision for the country, and he was going to adhere to it no matter what. He says, I think that he was a typical politician, that he was a pragmatist, someone who just wanted to do whatever worked, whatever got us out of the Depression, and whatever kept him reelected. And as you may know, he's the only president to have been reelected 3 times. So he was in his 4th term when he died of natural causes. So at any rate, you look at, for instance, his pre-election speeches. According to this book, he was all over the place. In some places, he gave speeches where he talked about spending less, the government, that is, spending less and demonstrating fiscal responsibility, right? Like a private business paradigm. Don't spend more than you have, right? That's ironic because his administration is going to engage in mass deficit spending, spending money that it did not have, and spending itself into debt to get everything going. His modus operandi, the way by which he did things, right? His methods, his MO with official and unofficial cabinet members. What he would do, right, is he would get his official cabinet members to say, first of all, he would go to the press, and he had these press conferences. And in these press conferences, he would try to get a good feel. He had as many questions as he did declarative comments, instead of, like Wilson, who kind of preached to the press in his press conferences. He inquired. He was a curious individual. He was an enigmatic individual, like kind of a puzzle of a guy. He was hard to really get to know. They contend that when it came to people, he was very savvy, a little bit sneaky, very sharp. And so he would ask the leaders of the press, just as many questions as he would give them comments on things, to try to get, supposedly, to feel out their ideas about certain programs that he was interested in, to see if there would be a popular backlash, or if there would be popularly, if his idea might be popularly embraced, etc. Then from those meetings, he would go to his official cabinet members and he would ask them, giving them, because he supposedly had, kind of like Warren G. Harding, an intellectual humility that bordered on insecurity, despite his Ivy League education, despite that he ran a newspaper at Harvard. He was an intelligent man and well-read, but he contended that he didn't have the answers himself, according to Leuchtenberg's book, that he didn't have a vision going into office himself. And he was reliant upon individuals that were more intelligent, more experienced than himself to try to feed off of them. So his cabinet members usually didn't have that radical of ideas, because remember, they weren't that radical of individuals as far as on the ideological spectrum of being way far to the left, like Marxist, or way far to the right, like fascist, or regressive, or wanting to go back to the good old American days, whatever that means, etc. And so they usually were pretty moderate, and they had kind of moderate ideas. Then he would make them meet at dinner with his unofficial cabinet members. And his unofficial cabinet members, like I mentioned with Ray Moley and Rex Tugwell, these gentlemen had become controversial through their writings. They had written some very bold, innovative things. And one of the things that earned them notoriety is they had traveled to Europe during the Depression, and they observed the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy. And they took a look at what programs they were running in those countries. And so just think about that in and of itself, right? A communist Soviet Union, fascist Germany and Italy. Do we really want to emulate anything that they're doing that far to the left and that far to the right, respectively? Well, these gentlemen wrote and said, hey, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because we ourselves don't declare ourselves to be communist nor fascist, doesn't mean that they didn't have some very well-planned and effective programs. And so they actually praised these dictators for some of the programs they were doing, economically in particular, to combat the Depression. And that earned them obvious notoriety back here in the US. Like, wow, why are you supporting these radicals in Europe? And so they would meet the unofficial cabinet members, his brain trust, if you will, with the official cabinet members, and they would inevitably get into conflict and debate and disagreement in their conversations. And Franklin Roosevelt, instead of like Thomas Jefferson, who could not handle that type of environment around him, supposedly, according to Leuchtenberg, Franklin Roosevelt thrived in that environment. He loved it. He loved disagreement. He loved debate. He loved dialogue. And he would virtually tell the two gentlemen, because usually it was a man that he had chosen, you guys cannot, I want you guys to go and meet with each other, and you guys cannot stop, basically. You can't give up your meeting until you have come up with a consensus, some middle ground between the unofficial cabinet members, usually somewhat radical ideas, and the official cabinet members, not so radical, moderate ideas. And so to Leuchtenberg, that's evidence that not that he was trying to sneak a revolutionary agenda into his administration behind the scenes, but that he simply praised the intelligence and the experience that these official and unofficial cabinet members possessed. And he was just trying to pick their brains and find out whatever would work. Not was necessarily was most radical or innovative, but simply what was the most intelligent, most practical avenue to take. So at any rate, that's something to think about from Leuchtenberg's book, is that he says this guy was a typical politician. He was very savvy, though, very sly and intelligent when it came to how he dealt with, politics and people. But as far as his ideology, that he was nowhere on the spectrum, that he didn't really have a stand, or have deep roots in any particular ideology, left or right or middle. But he just simply wanted to be reelected and to mitigate the symptoms of the Great Depression. And we're going to get into the details of this very soon. Then a third interpretation was that he was a demagogue, that demos is the people in Greek. And so a demagogue, right, is a manipulator of the people who becomes not so much on paper as it happened back in Greece, but becomes a virtual dictator, an autocratic ruler. And so he held special congressional meetings. When Congress would not do his bidding, he threatened to go to the public over their heads, and he appealed to the people through the press and through his public speaking and so forth. And he had a good rapport with the American people, especially via radio with his fireside chats. And a fireside chat, right? Something simple as just gaining people's trust and his empathy. He would say, "How are you doing today?" And so many Americans had virtually nothing left in their homes, if they even had a home during the Depression, except for radio. It was just one of the few things that people held on to the very last moment. And, you know, perhaps escapism, that perhaps a tie to humanity, I don't begin to know, but it is what it is. So a lot of Americans still had radios. And he would contend, "How are you doing today? How are you doing this week? It breaks my heart if you were not able to feed your children today. But I want you to know that today I did this, this, and this. I went to Congress and demanded that they do that, that, and that. And if they don't, I want you, the people, to be aware of it and to not reelect them into office." So in that sense, that was a bit of a classically demagogue-like MO to follow, arguably. And so he also asked Congress to abdicate, to give up some of its constitutional powers to him over the economy and give him a lot of latitude to do as he saw fit. And so you see a lot of, you know, perhaps desire for a power grab in that facet of his rule alone. And then when the Supreme Court began shutting down some of his New Deal laws passed by Congress, he packed the court. He tried to. He tried to get it up from 9 to 13. Why? So he could simply choose 4 pro-New Deal men, yes men, who would help him be safe with his legislation and not have it stricken down by the Supreme Court. So he acted unilaterally. And again, he ran 4 times for office and won 4 consecutive times without using that type of civic virtue and self-control that George Washington had used and choosing to give up after his second term. So those are all things to consider as well, viewing him as a demagogue. And remember, it's not necessarily either or. There could be a little bit of truth to each of these interpretations. All right, so keep that in mind. And then also that he was secretly conservative, according to Howard Zinn in his book, his People's History of the US. So for instance, when you look at the true radicals like Huey Long and his share the wealth policy, wanting to put a huge tax on the wealthy and in indirect ways to redistribute that into programs for the common people. So to take from the rich and give to the poor. Franklin Roosevelt called Huey Long the second most dangerous man in the nation. And that was behind Douglas MacArthur, and that's a whole other topic in the armed forces. But FDR clearly did not think highly of him and was scared and frightened by how far to the left Huey Long was down in Louisiana. Leftist organizations, the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW or Wobblies, the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, Franklin Roosevelt did not give support to these leftist organizations, not by any means. And when the sharecroppers in the Midwest rose in revolt because they were not getting paid by the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, he left them high and dry. And these are poor, regular farmers who were trying to fight for their families and to feed their families, etc. So he didn't seem that far to the left. And then also, what did he really do? Did he change capitalism? Absolutely, as we're going to see very soon. He changed it. He altered it. He added several governmental intervention tactics and programs for sure. But at the end of the day, he kept our capitalist economy. He saved it. He did not turn us to National Socialism like the Nazis or communism like the Soviet Union. After all, he was old wealth, right? Why would he want to share his wealth with the poor? And so as a wealthy man himself. And so some people contend that he was secretly conservative, masquerading as a radical ideologue, but it was not true. All right, so any questions so far? All right, let's see here. I want to share the page with the assignment, which I'm going to shortly put up. So for one, right, is the first one you see here, and the titles give it away, what the thesis is meant to convey. President Franklin Roosevelt is praised as an idealistic revolutionary, a man who truly did have a bold new vision for the country. All right, what are some of the things that he did that could be considered relatively bold? As for one, right, he went against the political machine of Tammany Hall instead of the old deferential system of this political machine that was clearly corrupt, of trying to gain its favor, which he could have, because God knows he had the connections. He took a stand against it. So evidence that he was a principled man. From the time he was in college as a young progressive, he contended that he was for the Democratic Party like his father, rather than his relative Teddy Roosevelt, who was a Republican. So again, going in his own direction, supposedly. The fact of his unofficial cabinet, right? Rex Tugwell and Ray Moley and these others might be used as evidence to convey that he knew where they stood. He knew how they had praised the Soviet Union with some facets of its collectivization of agriculture program. And he knew that it had some ties to his Agricultural Adjustment Act, some similarities, and he chose them and he enacted them and he asked Congress to pass such laws. So clearly he had a bit of a leftist radical side to him in doing such. So the collectivization, let's see here, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, what did it do? Is what it did, right, is it tried to rectify the problems of supply and demand. Because remember, demand is not just that you want something economically. Demand is that you have the means to buy it, right? And Americans were farming just tremendously as far as quantity of corn and wheat and produce, milk, etc., right? And there was not enough demand to buy it. So food was rotting in this country and was being thrown out while people were starving during the Great Depression. What a sad irony, right? And so he wanted to rectify that imbalance. Well, how does he go about doing that? Well, for one, is he gets the leaders in each of the major industries of the major crops and commodities and farming to meet with federal bureaucrats and decide upon production and quantity of production. So peach farmers, almond farmers, etc., right? They'd get together in their respective meetings and decide how much in excess they had produced that was not being bought. And they came to terms in the meetings with how they were going to put the supply back down to the level of demand. And that included, right, suggesting to farmers, right, to switch crops, to switch from almonds to walnuts or something completely different, right? And not just convince them to switch, but to subsidize them, to pay them, to cut down their trees, to let the land lay fallow for a season and replenish its nitrogen and nutrients, and to lay seeds for the new crop, right? So the government was paying people to switch crops and to limit their acreage of how much they grew of a given commodity. Now, this was not, it didn't go to the Soviet Union level of coercion, right? Stalin, my goodness, you didn't cooperate with his dictates on a planned economy, on how much, how many peaches to produce. You could end up getting arrested, deported to Siberia, or even killed. Obviously, we didn't go that way. But the government, like I said, it used the carrot and the stick, particularly the carrot, and trying to induce people by paying them to switch crops, to diminish their acreage and how much of that commodity they were cultivating. And then they had ways, which I don't recall, and I apologize, but there were ways in which the government subtly threatened people that if they didn't cooperate, they wouldn't receive federal patronage, they wouldn't receive help, etc., if they did not cooperate. So there was a bit of a strong arm behind it, but I wouldn't go so far as coercion. But think about that. This is a capitalist economy, and the government is telling farmers, stop growing almonds and now grow peaches, and we'll pay you to do this. That's a big, intrusion of the federal government's role in our capitalist economy, in the production process of farming. So you have that, right? And recall that who did they pay? Who did they subsidize to switch crops, to diminish acreage, etc.? They paid the farm owners, whoever actually owned that farmland. Well, what about the sharecroppers and the daily laborers? They weren't paid by the government. They weren't subsidized by the government. And so, as you could guess, if a farm owner gets paid to chop down his trees, let it lay fallow the land for a season, and then, plant seeds for a new crop, he's not going to need the same intensity and quantity of labor that he once had and needed. So what does he do? He takes that check from the government and he kicks the sharecroppers off his land and says, sorry, sucks to be you. I got mine and I don't need you, at least yet. And so that's when they rebelled, especially in Arkansas. And Franklin Roosevelt left those sharecroppers out to dry. So as far as just how radical he was, I don't know. Then you also have the Tennessee Valley Authority. And that's when the government directly produced hydroelectric power and provided it subsidized to the Southern people of the Deep South, particularly Muscle Shoals, Alabama. So the Tennessee Valley Authority, right, that no longer PG&E and these other hydroelectric powers. There was a guy named Insull who had a lot of scandals, who had once was running the Tennessee Valley Authority project. And I don't recall if he ended up actually going to prison, but he had a big trial and it was a big scandal. So the government says, you know what, we'll buy it out from the private company. will provide electricity, and we will simply sell it to the Southern people for whatever they can afford, for whatever they could afford. So to some people, this flirts with gas and water socialism. And with gas and water socialism, right, there are many derivations of Marxism, and you don't even have to be Marxist and follow Karl Marx to be a socialist, by the way, but he's most famously tied to both socialism and communism. But to me, gas and water socialism is like diet Marxism, without being too silly, is that you still believe in a capitalist economy of private ownership, private transactions of trading and selling and buying, etc., right? Still in private hands, not government hands. But you believe certain commodities, certain services ought to be exempted from the capitalist economy and be placed in a category of necessities, to be placed in the category of rights. Because now, right, under a capitalist economy, we don't have in our American political tradition or in our laws, we don't have anything that states it is our right to own a Tesla, right? A Mercedes or a mansion, or to go on so many vacations, to go to Europe, etc. That's not known in our capitalist economy and culture and tradition. That's not known as a right. That is supposedly by merit, right? By meritocracy. If you work hard enough and you accrue enough money, then you've earned the right to buy that Tesla, to travel to Europe, et cetera, to buy that mansion, etc. But when you look at medical care, when you look at public transportation, getting from here to there, right? When you look at gas and water and electricity, some people exempt those commodities and services and say those are different. Those ought to be considered a right that all Americans are entitled to, whether they can afford it or not. So that's what I mean by gas and water socialism, which some of the progressives had embraced during the progressive movement. And so with the Tennessee Valley Authority, that arguably flirted with gas and water socialism. That was pretty radical. All right. Then the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, at any given time, according to historian Alan Brinkley, 2.5 million Americans were directly employed by the federal government to do some type of job. And so we're not talking about the bureaucracy, right? The bureaucracy has been around since the beginning in our nation's history, where you work for the Treasury Department, you work for the Department of the Interior, the Justice Department, etc. You know, you're overtly doing the government's job. That's one thing, being a federal bureaucrat. No matter how bloated that class has become, our bureaucracy, there's nothing radical about that. You look at so many different empires, monarchies, democratic governments, they've all had bureaucracies, right? But when you're getting just a 9-to-5 job to do something like sweep the streets, plant trees, mow lawns, paint, act under the Federal Writers and Federal Art Project, Federal Theater Project, the government went out of its way to provide a myriad of jobs for Americans so that they can get paid. To directly, remember we talked about John Maynard Keynes, contending that it is the role of the government to provide purchasing power to ensure that the average American has purchasing power and can go to the local market and spend his or her money. That is the major criterion for a healthy economy. And that's exactly what the government's doing here under the Works Progress Administration. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. They put young men in military barracks. And this looked a lot like what fascist Germany was doing, Adolf Hitler, putting these young men into the military, into these military barracks, making them build roads and plant trees and do different types of landscaping and infrastructure work, waking them up with the wartime bugle, providing them with 3 meals a day, dictating that they could only keep 1/3 of their salary because they, after all, they were getting free room and board from the armed forces, and give and send 2/3 of their salary back to their families who desperately needed that spending money. So when you look at that, right, the CCC, the WPA, public works programs, direct employment by the federal government, that arguably is pretty radical for a capitalist economy. We had done nothing of the sort prior to Franklin Roosevelt in this nation's history. No president had him directly given a job to millions of Americans. Okay. So at any rate, you have that work relief. And then safety net policies like the Wagner Act. If it was the FARA, I think the acronym was FARA. Oh shoot, I'm so sorry. I'm not recalling at the moment. I have it somewhere in here. Okay, I apologize. But what exactly that acronym stood for? But like the FARA program, FERA, is the government did what it similarly to what it did in the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Is it met with the major industry leaders of steel, oil, textiles, etc., right? And decided on how much to have produced, and get this, even set price ceilings and price floors above and below which the employers could not put their price. But again, the government subsidized them. It bailed them out so they would not go under. And in return for subsidizing these industries and these corporations, right, the government demanded in return Section 7A of the Wagner Act. And that stated that minimum wages had to be paid a certain amount per hour, right? Workers' compensation for those who were injured, unemployment payments for those who were laid off, recognition of labor unions, and the labor union's right to collectively bargain to improve their working conditions. So this was huge, the Wagner Act of about 1935, as far as the rights of unions and the rights of workers, now with a national minimum wage and so forth. And there were some industries that did not cooperate with FARA, and some businesses that did not cooperate with FARA, and hence were punished by not being subsidized or helped in any way, but did not have to live up to the Wagner Act. So remember that domestic workers, right, like maids, certain cannery workers in certain industries, etc. The minimum wage law and labor union recognition law, unemployment, paychecks, etc., workers' comp did not apply across the board to all industries, but it took a big swath across the board. Most of the major industries, most of the major corporations joined the FARA for obvious reasons of being subsidized by the federal government. So if the government's paying farmers not to farm, if it's bailing out industrialists, if it's paying salaries to 2.5 million Americans every day or every week, where is this money coming from? Well, the government is engaging in deficit spending. It's spending money further into debt. But the idea is, under Keynesian economics or Keynesian economics, is that they're priming the pump. Now that they're ensuring that the average people are getting purchasing power and those people are going to the market and spending that money, it's going to get us out of debt in the long run. So it's short-term debt payments, right? Deficit spending to ensure purchasing power for long-term improvement to get us out of the Great Depression. So any questions so far? All right, number 2 is court history, and just in contending that he had a personal transformation. It reminds me of the hero's journey. I'm going to speed this up, okay, guys? I don't want to take too long. We're already 50 minutes into this, and so I'll go more quickly, okay? I promise. But with number 2, just look for a personal transformation via personal suffering and by way of his relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt. All right. Something happens to president, well, before he's president. I believe he was governor of New York at the time, just like Teddy had been. But at any rate, not long before he ran for president, he contracted polio and would never walk again and endured a lot of suffering. But he went down to Warm Springs, Georgia, and he met all these young children who were suffering from polio and couldn't afford the hot water treatment that he was receiving after the end of their summer camp. And he ended up buying that place and providing it for free for kids with polio. And some people think that was a game changer, that Franklin Roosevelt knew nothing but almost a charmed life besides the death of his father at a young age, and personal suffering, and his relationship with Eleanor, who was seen as a very special, for lack of a better adjective, very empathetic, very progressive as far as the progressive movement, very civically minded and civically virtuous woman Eleanor Roosevelt is depicted as, and that she brought the best out of him, and that almost cosmically these things destined him to be a compassionate, autocratic president over the country in its darkest hour during the Great Depression, when they needed someone with such empathy and compassion. All right. So William Leuchtenberg and his pragmatist, we've already gone over that. He was all over the place when it came to his speeches. More government spending and involvement, less government spending and involvement. His choice of almost conservative, moderately conservative official cabinet members and radical unofficial cabinet members as evidence that he didn't care as long as they came to a consensus. Men who he thought were just more intelligent and well-traveled beyond his limits. And so that he didn't have necessarily a fit ideology or plan for the country. He was just desperately looking to men more intelligent than himself for the answers and wanting to have them work it out. The fact that he was opposed to people on the left, Charles Townsend and others that were behind the Social Security, he thought were too radical. But when he saw the popularity of their idea about Social Security for the elderly, he ran with it, and he stole it basically from the left and was popularly embraced for it. Big business. If he was such a a radical ideologue who wanted to change the capitalist economy, why at the end of the day did he bail big business out? The big farms, the big farmers, and the big industrialists. Granted, he dictated things to them, how much to produce, what price they could set their commodities at. In some cases, with the Wagner Act, how they treated their workers. But at the end of the day, he still bailed them out. So why would a radical far to the left go to such great means at the end of the day to save big business during the Great Depression? And of course, Leuchtenberg says because he was not that far to the left. He was a pragmatist. Remember, pragmatist implies in a negative way that you're amoral, that you don't necessarily abide by a moral code. You simply want to do whatever works, no matter what that entails. Whatever yields the best practical results, that's what you're for. And it implies that you don't really take a stand, have a firm foundation anywhere on the political spectrum. Because again, all you care about are results. So that's Leuchtenberg's thesis. Now, this one, please keep in mind, okay, that I wrote this one tongue in cheek. All right. I do not necessarily believe number 4, but I feel like it's thought provoking and you probably have heard the thesis. So I went ahead and went with it anyway. All right. So please always remember that. Don't just imbibe any single number that you're reading. They're deliberately meant to be slanted and for you to be critical of. But, you know, conspiracies are historically and statistically difficult to carry out. There's so many loose parts, right? There's so many variables in and out of your control as a president, etc. But I convey the thesis here, and again, I'm smiling, suggesting that Franklin Roosevelt knew we were likely going to be attacked at Pearl Harbor, set up, allowed those ships to be set up as sitting ducks to provoke public indignation, so that due to this Japanese attack, he could finally get American public sentiment to promote joining the war. Before, in his eyes, it was too late. Because as you probably know, World War II goes over like a Rocky movie. The Axis powers from 39 to 42 just overwhelmingly, almost consistently routed the Allied powers. And not till at least like the spring of 42 did things start turning around slowly for the Allies. So Pearl Harbor was December 7th of 41. So still at that time, everything looked dark. England looked like she was on her last leg, fighting the Battle of Britain against a possible German invasion of England and Scotland. And Franklin Roosevelt made it clear where he stood and contended that it was imperative that we help England against Nazi Germany in particular. All right, so are there any questions?
I had a question.
Yes.
When you were going over number 3, one of the examples you gave was that FDR, he stole something from the left. You said he ran with it. I didn't catch what you said that he stole. Would you be able to say it again?
It's okay. It just the idea of Social Security.
Okay.
Yeah, the idea of Social Security of workers paying into a federal fund to receive stipends when they retire.
Okay.
All right, no problem. Anything else? Anybody else?
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome, as always. Thank you. I enjoy you guys participating and asking questions. All right, so you sure? So can I'm sorry, I don't mean to be obnoxious, but can I see a couple thumbs up? If you guys are with me, you follow through with this. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. And again, I want to apologize for not having posted this yet. Complete omission, and I apologize for it. And I will rectify it tonight. I'll finally put it up. All right, you guys hang in there, okay? I'm proud of you. I enjoy giving you your extra credit for this. You earn it for sure. And it's the closest thing we have to meeting in class. And so I love it.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Cody. Have a good day.
You as well.
Thank you.
Professor,
Yes.
I got a couple of questions. So
Sure.
for this week's assignment, right, there's like 4 or 5 quizzes due on Sunday.
Oh, is it at that time?
Yeah.
Let me write that down. Let's see here. I tell you what. Yeah, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna send out an announcement, and I'm gonna change the time of those quizzes so that they're not due the same night as your assignment.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah. And one other thing, the grading, we haven't had any of our assignments graded yet. So I was
Now,
wondering.
and I apologize for being far behind on that, but you should have. Oh goodness, I would have to take a look. I can't do it on the video because it'll show, and I put these on YouTube. It'll show individual names and grades and ID numbers, and I can't do that. But on my side, right? I know I've done at least 3 or 4 assignments. I mean, have you
All right.
literally not seen evidence for any?
No, like there's like the first couple of assignments that have been graded. The first quiz we took, that's also been graded. But most of the stuff we haven't done. Well,
Okay.
most of the stuff I haven't done hasn't popped up.
Okay. Well, like I said, some of that is definitely on me. I promise to try to catch up. But I'm a little concerned if you haven't received at least 3, if not 4, assignments. I know I've done 3 or 4, and so that concerns me if you have only had a couple. But let me take a look at that, and I'll literally write that down as well. But I appreciate your patience. And I will catch up with that. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you,
Yeah.
Shamgar.
Yeah, no problem. Because on my screen it says that I have the reconstruction assignment fully graded. The argumentative assignment was turned in late, even though I turned it in on time because, well, you told me to redo it or like resubmit it. And then test number 1, I have it graded, and test number 2. But other than that.
Okay. I'm gonna write your name down because I know that I've done the West, Turner's West, and I've done the Gilded Age. I believe both Gilded Ages. The first one on the robber barons and the second one on immigration policies.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna look up your name in particular to see if somehow that it eluded me.
All right.
Okay.
No
Professor?
worries.
All right. Thank you for letting me know.
Yeah, and thank
Professor?
you very much.
No
If
problem.
it helps, I can also say that I've only have the reconstruction assignment, and the West assignment have been graded.
Just those two.
Or of the argumentative assignments, the test 1
Yes.
and 2 have also been graded. Yes.
Oh, goodness. Okay. All right. Let me look into that. Okay. I'm so sorry.
No worries, Professor. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for letting us know, and don't worry about it.
I appreciate it, you guys. Yeah, I'm not going to make excuses. I somewhat have some, but I'm not going to use them. I'll start catching up, but I am still a little concerned unless I'm just delusional. I'm certainly not being deliberately dishonest. I could have sworn I've done the first 4. So yeah, let me look into that. Okay.
Yeah, no problems.
All right.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you
you.
guys.
You, Professor.
Yes, sir. Any more
Oh,
questions?
No.
Okay. All right. You guys have a good week. Okay, guys. Thank you.
You too.
Thank
Bye.
you for your patience. Okay. I
Professor.
appreciate you.